Tremors is a perfect monster movie. From its characters, to its pacing, to its tone, as well as its creature. It is the example of how this type of thing should be done. And that begins with how the film treats its characters. Tremors is a story about rednecks. And before I continue, I want to say that I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I was born in Kentucky, and I currently live in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. The descent is supposed to take place within about 50 miles of my home. I love Southern culture, and when I say redneck, it comes from a place of love and admiration. Now, there are traditionally two very different types of portrayals of rednecks in media, and each have very different agendas. And how these portrayals are done affects the entire tone of that piece of media, and changes everything about how that story is told. Jerry Springer, Trailer Park Boys, Vacation, the Ernest movies, Nothing But Trouble, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Wrong Turn films are example of this first category, that use rednecks to create fear or are there to be laughed directly at. We aren't laughing with Ricky when he does stupid shit, we're laughing at Ricky. These tend to feature a lot more trashy humor and horror, and are exaggerated in making the trashiness so extreme to the point that it is either funny, surreal, scary, or upsetting. With the funny characters almost always being alcoholics, and the scary characters usually being cannibals or inbred banjo-playing monsters, who are chasing characters that are almost always young out-of-towners on a road trip. The second type is a more idealized view of rural culture. These types of movies are generally aimed at those rural or southern audiences, and they present a still exaggerated, yet quaint and relatable look at this type of lifestyle, that reaffirms the aspects of that way of life that are frequently made fun of in other types of films. For instance, an early scene in Tremors has Kevin Bacon use an old toilet as a beer cooler, but the way that this is filmed and presented isn't intended to be derogatory towards his character. It is not meant to say that he is lesser as a person for having to do this. It is meant to be less trashy than it is funny. We laugh with Bacon and the economic status that he feels stuck in rather than at him. These types of shows and movies also do frequently make fun of the characters and show their faults or character flaws, but primarily at the end of the day, these stories tend to be a more wholesome outlook on the human side of this type of culture, with a more positive storytelling motive. I think that most Stephen King stories would also fit into this second category, because even though they too do not take place in the South, he places rural, simple life characters into a situation of horror, and forces us to see things through their perspective and makes us hope for their well-being. And of course, you also have films that overlap between the two, such as Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, that while making us sympathize with the redneck characters more than any of the other characters, still plays off the traditional stereotypes that make fun of Southerners. So there are no hard and fast rules here or firm boundaries. I love both types of stories, and if I'm being honest, I do usually prefer the first type. Trailer Park Boys is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. But Tremors definitely falls into the second category, where we are empathizing with the rednecks and their small town way of life, not fearing them. Saving and protecting the town and the people who live there is the goal of the story. And this is really important to take the time to make this distinction, because it sets the tone of how the series handles its characters, which is really important in a monster movie. At no point are we ever to be afraid of the humans in a Tremors film. The horror is derived in each of these from us being worried if they're going to make it out alive or not. We want them to be able to save their town. It's the whole goal of the story. And if the first film had not taken the time to make us care about these characters first in the way that it does, before introducing the monster, then later entries into the franchise may have veered more into this first category of redneck depiction, by gaining humor out of making fun of these people who come from poor economic backgrounds. So when it comes to Tremors, the people come first, and what they fear and are protecting themselves from are the graboids. Giant subterranean worms that can feel even the smallest seismic waves from miles away and can quickly leap up from the ground and devour people whole while they're walking on the surface. This is a pretty ridiculous concept, but the reason that it works so well here in this movie is the way that it's presented to us in the audience, as the pacing in the Tremor script is incredibly tight and gives us information in steps in a logical way. When the story begins, we find Earl and Val down on their luck, working odd jobs just to get by, and we sit with them and see their world and their situation as it is for the first 14 minutes of the movie. And this setup is really important, because we get to see them, and get to know them and empathize with them. We are also introduced to most of the supporting characters as well, and we learn a little bit about the town that they live in. And we get to see the first sign that not everything is right here, as Val and Earl run into a seismologist out in the desert, who is studying unusual activity in the area. So this isn't downtime. There's a lot going on in this short section, and is the proper way to set up a character-driven story from a writing perspective. On their way out of town, the pair sees the local drunk, Edgar Deems, up on top of an electrical tower, and they decide that they can't just leave him up there, and they have to help him down, only to discover that Edgar Deems is a dead man. They learn from the doctor that he died of dehydration, and they wonder what could have forced him to stay up on that tower for days until this happened, especially considering that he was found with a loaded rifle strapped to him. But deciding that there's nothing else they can do, they get back in their truck and continue down the highway. But their adventure is stopped again when they discover a field of parts of dead sheep, and the local farmer, Old Fred, buried up to his neck in the desert sand. A few minutes later, their path is blocked by rocks that have covered the road. A lone, bloody helmet lies abandoned. Defeated, they drive back to town and find what appears to be part of a creature wrapped around the axle of their truck. It isn't until 33 minutes into the movie that they really discover what they are dealing with, by witnessing their horses get eaten in front of them. And this is perfect, because through slow escalation, our curiosity builds. We are introduced to the monster little by little over the course of a half hour. And by doing this, we can accept the concept much easier because it isn't all dumped in our lap all at once. It isn't immediately Kevin Bacon versus the giant worms from the beginning. We build up to that in a way that makes sense and is believable. We are taken on a logical journey to that destination with these characters. The best scene of the film as far as setting up a franchise is concerned comes next, where the graboid biology is discovered by the main characters through examining the body of the monster in a semi-scientific way after they kill the first one that they encounter. This is a super important aspect that I don't think is really considered a lot of the time, because when the exact extent of the monster is understood, then it makes moments where the characters are in danger more tense, because we know the exact possible repercussions of what is going on. The argument can be made that by knowing more about the monster, the less scary that monster is, but I don't think that's the case with every type of monster. Pinhead is scary, for instance, because of the unknown. The mythology of that world is esoteric, and the fear is established in the unimaginable possibilities at his fingertips. But with a more grounded physical monster like the graboids, the Thing, the Alien, or the Gremlins, I think it is really important through scenes like this for the audience to have a really good idea of what the monster is capable of, and how the rules of that monster work on a biological level. Because through audience understanding is where future stakes are developed. And oftentimes these types of scenes can be the most memorable and culturally iconic of the whole movie. Everyone knows that you cannot feed a mogwai after midnight. Everyone who has seen The Thing remembers how tense the blood test scene was the first time they watched it. In Return of the Living Dead, this type of scene cemented the idea that zombies eat brains. And similarly, this scene in Tremor sets up the stakes for the movie because we as the audience now understand exactly how dangerous these monsters can be. We see how much damage they can cause earlier in a gradual progression, and here we see them physically in full for the first time, and learn much more about how dangerous they really are. And through this is where the horror is built, because we as the audience know that there are still 3 of these things alive and hungry out there somewhere in the desert. And this scene would impact the future of the franchise more than just about any other in this movie, because all future variations on the creature are based on information that is delivered right here. And the rest of the movie with this knowledge turns into a human fight for survival, as our main characters struggle to battle for their lives while also not touching the ground in creative ways, making it a really fun monster movie and one of the best to come out of the 90s. Tremors 2, which was released 6 years later, is a similar sequel to Aliens in a way, where you have a mostly new cast that accompanies someone who is already very familiar with the monster on a monster hunt, and it has most of the same strengths and weaknesses of that movie. We start with Earl from the first film, who has since the last time we saw him both found and lost fame and fortune. And this is something that I really love about Tremors 2 that most horror franchises never do, as we actually get to see the global reaction to the events of the previous film in the beginning of this one. We find out that Earl and Val both went on talk shows like Good Morning America, and were featured on the cover of People magazine. They starred in a Reebok commercial, and even had a licensed Graboid arcade game. And I really love this, because it separates Tremors from a lot of other franchises, in that here the events of the past films matter and aren't ignored. A lot of horror sequels just bring back the main antagonist with a fresh group of characters who are not aware of what happened in the previous films. But here we actually get to see how the entire world reacts, even if in a small way. Because even other horror franchises that have a continuing story from film to film, like Phantasm, the world at large isn't really aware of what is happening for the most part. And so it is cool to see that played with here by making these characters national celebrities for surviving giant worm attacks. And it is also a little bit sad, because Earl has taken that money that he made from his global exposure and tried to invest it in an ostrich farm that is not doing well financially. It is failing, and he will soon find himself full circle back to where he was at the beginning of the first movie, which is ultimately what brings him to Mexico, to help deal with the new graboids that have emerged there, after being offered a large sum of money from an oil baron for each one that he kills. And so through this, the ramifications of the previous film kick off the events of this film, and that's really nice and fairly uncommon to see. I really like the depiction of Mexico in this movie. Typically when you think of Mexico in media, you probably imagine a vast, open, barren desert with broken down cars, shacks, and a yellow Breaking Bad filter placed over top it. And so to go from the American desert in the previous film to this really lush, green, open landscape with modern buildings in this one, I think is a very inspired decision to make for depicting this area that doesn't play into traditional visual stereotypes. But I will say, for a movie that takes place in Mexico, there sure aren't a lot of Mexicans in it. All of the main characters, except for the Mexican oil executive Carlos Ortega, who hires the team, are white. And there's also only 3 on-screen character deaths in the movie, all of which are Mexicans who work in the oil fields, which really is a pretty bad reoccurring problem in this early era of the franchise. The budget for this film was slashed right before production was supposed to begin, as Kevin Bacon decided at the last minute to act in Universal's other film, Apollo 13, instead of this sequel, which is when it was decided that Tremors 2 would now be direct-to-home video, which left the filmmakers with a very ambitious script that had to quickly be reworked with a new budget of $4 million instead of $17 million. And so with this, despite it being a really great second film that turned out great considering the circumstances, Tremors 2 is unfortunately already where the franchise begins to fall apart in certain aspects. And through that, I'm not trying to say that it's a bad movie at all, but this second film does prove that Tremors needs a fairly large budget to continue to function as an action-based horror film. And what I mean by that is that because of the lack of funds, the established mythology of the universe begins to break. We know from the first film that cars, bulldozers, and buildings are not safe places to be, and that you can still easily get attacked while standing on top of them. There really isn't a safe place to hide from graboids, just places that are safer than others. The whole point of the second act of the first movie is that they are trapped on a caving roof and don't know how to get down safely. But destroying a lot of buildings and cars gets to be pretty expensive. So starting here, for the rest of the franchise, they are absolute safe zones from graboid attacks, as long as you aren't close to any windows. And the ground is generally pretty safe to just casually walk around on most of the time, even when near a graboid. And it is because of this that I would argue that Tremors 2 starts off badly, but finds its footing by the end. Because they do a really smart thing by introducing a new, smaller scaled aspect of the graboid lifecycle, called Screechers, that are still really effective and scary, but probably much cheaper to pull off from a production standpoint. And this decision leads to the best third act in any Tremors film, where the characters are trapped in and around a building surrounded by a large number of the small monsters and have to engineer an escape plan. And introducing these small monsters, I think, was overall the best decision they could have made, because the first half of this movie removes all tension that has been previously built up from the traditional graboids. In the first Tremors movie, the entire town is fighting very hard for survival against only 4 of them. And a lot of people don't make it out of that movie alive. The monsters have a real, tangible power over the human characters in that film. But because of the more action-based style that this sequel has, there's a fun montage set to music at the beginning of it, where Earl, Bert, and Grady kill 16 of them in a pretty effortless manner. They even seem to be enjoying themselves while doing it, and the whole thing feels more like they're on a fishing trip instead of a monster hunt. And by doing this, they kind of ruin the graboids from being seen as a genuine threat. You can't have a montage of killing close to 20 of them easily, and then make them scary again in the same movie. It just doesn't work that way. In part 1, you are tense the whole time because you know what these things are capable of. And to me, it really doesn't make sense why they would ruin their own monster like that. But once they replace the graboids with the Shrieker variety about halfway into the story, it feels like the film finally starts and becomes tense again. And so with that, considering how the movie could have turned out, I think that we're pretty lucky to have an entry that by the end of it, almost reaches the high bar that the first film set. Tremors 3: Back to Perfection is where the franchise begins to feel a little frustrating, as Fred Ward, who plays Earl, would decide not to return again to the franchise, and Michael Gross's Burt Gummer would now slide into the main character slot. Now, this makes a lot of sense, I think, on paper, as the main characters would not have survived either the first or second films had he not been there. But in execution, to me, it is kind of like if you removed Hank Hill from King of the Hill, and then tried to make the show entirely about Dale Gribble presented from his point of view, while also turning his personality up to about 12. Burt and Dale are almost the exact same character, complete with a surveillance/survival bunker under their house, with a built-in arsenal of guns and explosives. But without a grounded main character to balance out the manic personality of this side character, everything surrounding that character immediately becomes a lot more campy and goofy, resulting in the film in general being tonally off from what came before. Burt in the first film is almost an antagonistic force. He helps out a lot and the main characters definitely care for him, but the feud on the rocks near the end is the biggest human versus human conflict in that film. And I think in the second movie he's at his best. A lot of his campy action happens off-screen, which was a last-minute decision that ended up benefiting the film. As originally in the script, we were supposed to have full-on action scenes with Burt, where he's off on his own killing graboids with a tank. But all of these action bits got scrapped once the budget was cut down. But I think this was ultimately a really good thing, as through this he gets to tell the main characters about it, while delivering some of his best lines in the franchise.
I feel I was denied critical, need-to-know information. Once I got on board, I handled with a combination of small arms fire and hand-to-hand techniques. I am completely out of ammo. That's never happened to me before.
And this was well done because Burt still gets to have some over-the-top character moments, while still keeping the grounded, realistic tone of the film. And we also get to see how he views the situation that he's in, because he's actually talking about it and giving dialogue instead of silently going through it. In fact, he's so good in this one scene that his entire character in all future installments would pretty much just be references and callbacks to this bit, almost to the extent that it makes me wish a little that this scene didn't exist, because it was pretty much when it was decided that it was okay to abandon good writing and turn this character into kind of a cartoon. It's not a problem in 2, but it quickly develops into one in 3. He was also sidelined in a really tense way at the end of that movie, by being stuck in the blade of a bulldozer unarmed, surrounded by screechers for most of the third act. And I feel like this is the best way to handle him. Give him great, fantastic, bombastic moments to shine in, and then put him away for the next while, before you build up to use him again for another scene. It is even okay to have him sweep in at the end and save the day. He has, after all, trained for his whole life for this sort of thing, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense if he didn't help out significantly in the final battle of each film. But in the later movies, where he's all action star Burt all the time, it can get pretty tiring. And this starts right here in the transition of making him the main character of 3. And by having him in almost every scene of the movie, it generally doesn't work very well in my opinion. And because of this decision, here is where the franchise changes from horror action to mainly just action, which does hurt the overall tone of the series. The appeal of the Jurassic Park movies, for instance, is not paying to watch velociraptors get mowed down with machine guns. The draw of giant monster movies is that humans are suddenly not on top of the food chain, and we get to watch as they come to terms with that, and have to use their intelligence to figure out how to survive around a new apex predator that is both physically intimidating and actively hunting them. The first Tremors is great for that, and the second one by the end of it is as well. But with Burt and his massive arsenal of weapons as the entire focus from here on, the graboids are now mostly just an inconvenience to deal with rather than any serious threat. But through all that, I'm not trying to say that I dislike the character. Burt is a great character and can be used to great effect. I just think he's been used improperly a few times. Dale Gribble is similarly also a great character, but the Dale Gribble show would be hard to pull off from a writing perspective. In the right way, Burt can be quite fun to watch and is great in a lot of his appearances. And I also have to say that I personally respect Michael Gross for staying with the franchise for so long, and working as a horror action icon even into his 70s. I don't mean anything personal against him or his abilities because he's a genuinely great actor. And you rarely find franchises that keep at least one actor from the first film for so long, let alone every single entry with this much commitment and involvement in the narrative. And so the fact that he's still currently doing these movies today is really cool and admirable. One of the big appeals to me about Tremors is the fact that it is a horror franchise that takes place almost entirely in the daytime. And the first two films really embrace that and make an original daytime experience. But the entire third act of this movie is filmed at night and loses a part of that strong, hot desert identity for me, which is kind of a bummer. But the scene where Burt fights a monster in the tight constraints of a trailer in the climax is still really tense and well done. And the last thing that I don't think works very well here is the new variant of Graboid called the Assblasters, which are the result of letting the Screechers mature into an older age. I don't really have anything against them on a conceptual level. The idea of a flying Screecher that can shoot flames if used the right way could be really exciting to see. But in execution, it is pretty bad here. The film was released in 2001, and the CGI used on the Assblasters when they're flying feels exactly like it was made in 2001. It is not aged well even in a charming way, and is distracting a good bit of the time. But there are aspects to this film that I really love. This is the first time that we return to the desert town of perfection in 11 years, and seeing some of the same faces show up is quite nice, even if they don't have a ton to do with the overall plot or events of the story. Jodie Chang is introduced here in this movie, the niece of Walter from the first one, who has taken over his old store and gets a chance to actually fight in the action, have cool scenes, and make it to the end of the film. Unlike her uncle, who came up with the idea that the monsters should be called Graboids before immediately being eaten by one. And sadly, in this same vein, the only legacy character from the first film that they kill is the Hispanic man, Miguel, which at least for me adds a little bit of an underlying uncomfortableness with the early entries of this franchise. But I think with the introduction of the character of Jodie, it feels like they were beginning to realize a problem that was growing within these movies that had to be addressed. Overall, I may sound harsh on Tremors 3, but that doesn't mean it isn't fun. It definitely is. And I think to some degree there hasn't been a Tremors entry that isn't at least that. But it does have a ton of problems in it that are fairly significant, that show the beginning cracks that would grow into being more major faults in the franchise later on down the line. Following the third film 2 years later, the Sci-Fi Network would develop a Tremors TV series that pretty much utilizes Tremors 3 as the first establishing episode. It takes place in the Perfection Valley and uses characters from the first movie and third one. Except for some reason, literally all of them except for Burt and Melvin have been recast with new actors. But as sad as that is to see, it's pretty easy to get past it quickly as a viewer. It also picks up on plot lines left hanging from the third movie that weren't fully closed, such as Melvin trying to take over the valley but not being able to because of the giant barren albino worm El Blanco that lives there, that Burt takes care of as a sort of pet, as well as the Assblaster that Nancy captures to sell off to Las Vegas magicians. Overall, the show is really great, and they figure out a fun way to bring in the already established monsters as well as creating new ones for the characters to deal with. A lot of the minor characters from Tremors 3 become more central characters to the world of this show, and their more down-to-earth personas balance Burt in the way that he should be. Burt doesn't even play a major role in every episode, because they were filming Tremors 4 at the same time as this, and he was having to go back and forth between the two projects. Which really benefits the show, because it allows all these other characters to take their own momentary spotlight. The show, sadly, was doomed from the beginning though, because of the way that it was handled by the network. As Sci-Fi felt that the first few episodes were not exciting enough, and so to try and artificially boost ratings, they made the baffling decision to air the 13 episodes out of order, to have some of the more action-heavy episodes from later in the season come first. Meaning that instead of the chronological order they were supposed to be presented in, they now are shown in the order of 1, 6, 7, 3, 9, 4, 8, 5, 10, 12, 13, 11, and 2. Which resulted in character growth not making any logical sense. and also characters being introduced to the townspeople near the end of the season that had already had their character arcs completed in previous episodes, confusing general audiences and causing the show to be prematurely cancelled. Which is a shame, because the TV series is a really good, campy, early 2000s time, and even though it isn't all good, it does still have some of the best Tremors content in it, and I'm sad we never got more of it, especially considering the rumors that both Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward were supposed to make appearances in the second half of the season that was never produced. Tremors 4: The Legend Begins is a shockingly good movie. What I love about these franchises is that somewhere in the middle they usually just decide to say the hell with it and do something really weird, and that is this movie. Because Tremors 4 is a western set in 1889. I know it's kind of unpopular to compliment Scott Buck on the internet after how Dexter ended and how Iron Fist and Inhumans turned out, but he also did work on the earlier good seasons of Dexter as well as 6 Feet Under, Rome, and The Oblongs, so I don't think he's the worst writer in the world by any means. And I think that this movie really benefited from having him as the sole writer, because here he really makes sure that the characters are again the focus of the story. The character writing in this film is second best in the franchise, only behind the first one, and I believe that is the result of bringing him on to work on this one. The style in which this movie handles its characters is similar to modern quality television, where everyone has clearly defined personalities and wants and desires and arcs, which in my opinion is more fun to watch and is more engaging than the character work of John Welpley, who wrote parts 3, 5, and 6, where the unchanging characters fall more in line with his earlier work on shows like Baywatch, General Hospital, MacGyver, and The Love Boat. Those 3 movies feel like old TV to me, with static trope characters with quippy, meaningless dialogue, whereas part 4 is more similar to Tremors 1 and 2, with more realistic while still fun characters that change and grow by the end of the film and participate in an actual story. Michael Gross is given a lot to work with here, and he is easily showing the best of his acting abilities in this movie than anywhere in the other films. Here he's playing Bert's great-grandfather Hiram, a rich elitist businessman from Carson City, who arrives in the town of Rejection, because the mine he owns there has stopped production because several miners have disappeared mysteriously. We, as the audience, obviously know that they've been eaten by graboids, but the characters don't, and that's what makes this exciting and suspenseful. We get to see people figure things out again, to see them not quite know what is happening. And by having Gross play against type from what we would expect of him, based on other movies, he is able to develop a really interesting character that makes us question from the beginning what to expect. And seeing him grow from a greedy businessman who doesn't understand the plight of the average man, to spending his very last dime buying guns to help the citizens of Rejection protect their land from graboids, is really well done and believable. But the supporting cast of this movie is really what makes it special, as here there are at least as many POC characters as there are white characters, if not more. And only white characters die in the movie with the exception of the miners in the very beginning, which feels like the creative team trying in a way to make up for the slight racism that the first 3 movies had. Because in those early entries, the writers used POC characters to make the monsters seem more threatening for the white characters by killing them off first. The Changs really benefit the most from this, and seeing their growth through the franchise is really fun. Even though I like Walter in the first movie a lot and think that Victor Wong played him in a really funny and memorable way, his defining character trait in that movie is still that he was extremely cheap and petty, and he functionally was only in the story to make the graboids seem like a more legitimate threat by having him killed off really early in front of the other characters. Jodie in the third movie is a step up from this, where she actually gets to shoot guns and fight monsters, and she is fleshed out even more in the show to becoming a more fully fledged character. And here, all of that comes to the forefront, where we get to see the first Changs that have immigrated from China, that have settled in the valley, and they get to play an integral role in saving the town from the graboids. They are the ones who convince Hiram that the town is worth saving, and are the ones who later rename the town to Perfection. They play as much of a part in the story that Michael Gross does, and the movie works really well in an ensemble way, rather than relegating the non-white characters to the background or sidekick levels, while he alone saves the day. It is a definite team-up that forms by the end of it, and each individual brings their own skills. The best character in the film, though, has to go to the Boba Fett of the Tremors franchise, Blackhand Kelly. who shows up and looks really cool and gives an extremely memorable, quick performance, before immediately getting eaten by a giant worm. This is great from a storytelling perspective, because Kelly is the most experienced combat fighter in the cast by a large margin, and the fact that he gets eaten first out of the main characters really establishes that the Graboids are a genuine threat this time around, and that anybody can possibly be killed. Also, as a quick, mostly unrelated note, I've recently been going through the Dark Tower books, and when I'm reading them, I imagine Billy Drago as Roland because of this movie, who I think would have been a really good book-accurate fit for that character, rather than a handsome Clint Eastwood type. And you know what? Tremors 4 may have not been successful on any financial level, and it may have killed the franchise for 11 years. But I don't think that's really a bad thing in the grand picture of it all. Sometimes things just need a break. Halloween 2018 would not have had nearly the anticipation in the lead up to it like it did if we had just received a Michael Myers movie 2 or 3 years previously. Things just need to go away sometimes. And I would rather that the last film before a long break be something creative, special, and new that tried different things, rather than just being a shameless rehash of an earlier sequel. Speaking of shameless rehashes, 11 years later, Tremors 5 Bloodlines would be released. As I mentioned a moment ago, I believe that John Welpley has gotten away with writing the same movie 3 times now, as this is essentially just Tremors 3, but this time in Africa. This for me is the low point of the series, and as far as low points are concerned, this one does get by with doing a few interesting things. We find Bert 12 years after we last saw him in the TV series, and he's not fared very well in the new digital age. Whereas he used to be a celebrated globe-traveling monster hunter, he now runs a failed doomsday prepper business through his YouTube channel, which is weirdly a pretty accurate trajectory for his character to take, and I'm glad that they at least started him at a low point, so that he could have somewhere to climb to by the end of the film. But this is about where my compliments for this one ends, because in the middle of them making an interesting character decision with Bert, they immediately interrupt themselves with Jamie Kennedy entering the franchise on a dirt bike. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally down on a deep, primal level strongly dislike Jamie Kennedy. And this might not be fair, but just for me, with him being the sidekick long-lost son of Bert in both 5 and 6, it immediately brings those 2 movies down a few significant pegs. Like I said, he is literally introduced into this movie by dirt bike montage like it's still 2002, and it's as horrible as you would imagine. In fact, this movie feels more stuck in the early 2000s than the Tremors movies that were actually made in the early 2000s, which is the biggest problem going for it. And I mostly blame this on the fact that this is the first Tremors entry that wasn't worked on by either S.S. Wilson or Brent Maddock, who co-wrote the screenplays for the first 2 films as well as the television series. And through their company Stampede, they stayed on as a guiding hand for the franchise up through the 4th one. Wilson even directed parts 2 and 4, with Maddock directing the 3rd one. And after the failure of part 4, the pair tried for several years to get a 5th film made, that was to take place in Australia, to no avail. They were eventually forced out of the franchise that they created by Universal Studios, who decided to move forward in a new direction for the franchise without them. They would later say in their press release about this event that, while they pointed out that they had no further contractual obligations to Stampede, they did offer us executive producer positions. But they also made it clear that in this new, even lower budget project, that Stampede Partners' participation would be severely restricted, with little control over cast, director, special effects, locations, or indeed any aspect of production, without meaningful creative control allowing us to guarantee the integrity of our Tremors vision. We have sadly declined to be involved. And I think without their vision overlooking the process, the writing takes a massive step down here, as I imagine without them, series veteran writer John Welpley was given more authority over the characters and their direction, and I don't really think this was a good thing. This one, as well as part 6, feels like they're trying to make a Marvel-style movie on a direct-to-DVD budget, in the way that all the characters talk in one-liners and comebacks, and it's pretty grating to watch. Literally everyone in these 2 movies aren't aware of each other at the beginning. We see them meet by coming together to fight the Graboids as a team. And the fact that in this highly intense environment, these people who don't know each other are bouncing banter back and forth doesn't feel earned. In the first movie, everyone knows each other extremely well, and they play off each other's strengths and weaknesses. That was the benefit of setting it in a small town where all the characters had lived their entire lives around each other. There's no actual work that goes into the character development here, which makes being invested in what happens to these people almost impossible. They really could have played up Bert not knowing that he had a son, and tried to do something emotional with that, but it's mostly just used for dialogue and gags. Pretty much none of the character writing in these two entries works, because they're trying to wring so much humor from it to a point of being unrealistic, and almost none of the jokes land as well. The worst example of this is this horrible moment where Bert gets locked in a cage, and results within just mere hours to drinking his own piss, swishing it around in his mouth and declaring that it's an acquired taste. The film does benefit from being made in more modern times by being able to rely more heavily on CGI for the monsters, which is something that might not normally be a great thing in some circumstances. But as stated before, Tremors is such a difficult concept to pull off well on a small budget that the CGI is a welcomed addition that works pretty well most of the time. The Assblasters have mutated to be giant this time around, which I'm not too thrilled with because it raises a lot of unanswered questions. But the way the graboids move and look is super fluid and done well for a film of this nature. And you can see from the different designs that the team responsible for this at least really did care and consider how best to create a giant monster like this on such a small budget. The end sequence here involves Bert watching a child electrocute the ground to get worms to come up to the surface. And through this, he gets the idea to do this on a massive scale, with a lightning rod and a graboid to try and kill it while it's above ground. And as stupid a concept as this is, it admittedly makes for a really cool visual, and a great way to end a pretty lackluster return for the franchise. Tremors 6, A Cold Day in Hell, was released in 2018, and with a title like A Cold Day in Hell, and a DVD cover like this, you would expect the premise to be graboids in the snow. But you'd be wrong. Admittedly, the very first scene does take place in the snow and does feature a cool graboid kill. But that is only the first 4 minutes of this hour and 45-minute movie, with one other scene taking place in perfection, and the entire rest of the film taking place in a camp at the base of the mountain, that has no snow, and looks like the same sandy landscape that's been in all the other movies, just with a cool-toned filter over it this time. Even in the snowy intro, you can clearly see that the snow is actually just color-corrected sand, with digital snowflakes over top it. The snow idea was a really good change of pace, but if they couldn't have pulled it off, then I think they should have abandoned it for a more achievable setting. I was really excited when I heard the announcement for this, because I was anticipating them to switch it up and do something different like they did with Part 4, and thought that the Arctic setting would be great for this, because it would put Bert into a place that he wasn't necessarily used to, and make him show some of the resourcefulness that he had in earlier films, which was an aspect of his personality largely missing in 3 and 5, where he was in a familiar setting just going through the motions. But this place may as well still be Nevada because the setting has absolutely no play in their survival whatsoever. They say constantly that Bert is a doomsday prepper, a survivalist, but we really haven't gotten to see him use those skills in a meaningful way since the second one. He has a few moments here and there, like in 3 where they use a mattress to shield themselves from the thermal vision of the Assblasters, but I would love to see more of that from him, because that ingenuity is where his character shines the most. The problem with doing these later sequels is that by this point they have already explained the entire life cycle of the graboid. We see them as they are in 1, their next phase with the Shriekers in 2, the egg-laying Assblasters in 3, and the newborn leaping phase in 4. And so starting in 5, they don't really have any new parts of the life cycle to introduce to the audience. But in trying to stick with tradition and formula of having a new idea about the graboids introduced in each movie, they have to start making things up about them that when examined is a little universe-breaking, such as the larger African variants in that film. And for this entry, they introduce a parasite that humans can contract from the graboids, that afflicts Bert and endangers his life through the whole movie. The only problem from this though is that they create a logical error in their writing, by saying that he contracted the parasite from temporarily being eaten back in Tremors 3, that takes place in 2001, 17 years before this movie, rather than having it be a new thing that he gets at the beginning of this film. And so it's stuff like this that reality has to be thrown completely out the window and not thought about. Because the fact that he went 17 years without showing any symptoms, and now within hours he's on death's door, is a pretty hard thing to swallow. Especially considering that it is a trope since the beginning of the franchise, that at some point in every movie, someone is going to get covered in exploded graboid guts. And so far, no one else that we know of has gotten sick. And the fact that it happens at the exact same time as the newest graboid attack is just asinine and frustrating to think about. I get that the appeal of these later movies is just to see how crazy they get in a Sharknado kind of way, and I do think that that's a must-have quality in a good B-film, but I do also long for the time of the first two movies, where they tried to add more tense horror moments with these action scenes. Those two aspects don't have to be mutually exclusive. This entry does do some great stuff with the graboids though, because for the very first time since the first movie, cars and buildings are no longer safe places to hide in. They again thrust up through the floors and knock over buildings and cars, and overall it looks surprisingly great. The movie also brings back some of the earlier camera tricks, like having a point of view shot from the graboid's perspective, along with lots of little callbacks, such as a graboid knocking up the boards on a walking path just like in the first movie, as well as them using liquid pouring on the ground to get the monster's attention. Normally, nostalgia baiting in replacement of solid writing isn't a good thing, but seeing as that's some of the only well done stuff in this one, it's better left in the film than not. That being said, even within the film's own logic, they write themselves into a corner with these callbacks to the first film, as I don't entirely buy it when they trap a graboid in a shipping container in the film's climax, when we have literally just moments ago watched it toss a similar shipping container through the air as if it were nothing. But I get that it's just supposed to be schlocky action and I'm not supposed to think about it all that hard, so I'm just happy to see these early elements return. But a lot of the goodness is undercut and hard to appreciate when you have cringy moments like here, where this lady is about to be eaten, and Jamie Kennedy tells her to take off her pants so that he can pull her to safety. And they have enough time to have some cute back and forth banter about why she doesn't want to do that because she didn't wear any underwear that day. Meanwhile, the graboid just sort of waits and hangs out for them to be finished. It's a pretty gross treatment of the female characters and is a reoccurring problem in both 5 and 6.
And I'm Travis B. Welker. I've been accused of being a ninja photographer, an adrenaline junkie, and hitting on hot 22-year-olds. I'm guilty on all accounts.
Jamie Kennedy also, just as a whole here, is even worse than last time. They try really hard to give him scenes that make him look like the ultimate badass, like riding a four-wheeler with a bomb on it into a graboid to kill it. And I know that it's a staple at the end of each Tremors movie to have a romantic scene, usually featuring a kiss, but this is not it. He is constantly framed like the coolest guy on Earth, and that aspect of this is pretty bad for me. But your mileage may vary. Also, Val and Rhonda from the first movie's daughter is the main female lead in this one, and that could have, been used for something interesting. They could have paralleled her role with Jamie Kennedy's and how Burt views his own child that he never wanted, against someone that he sees as a metaphorical child that he feels responsible for protecting during the graboid attack. But absolutely nothing is done with her character aside from a conversation about how Val and Rhonda have been doing since the first movie. Her whole character's existence is just to tell us about the status of different characters that we have not seen now in 28 years, and she honestly might as well just not be in the film. The biggest thing that I absolutely hate about this movie though, is that at the beginning it shows that Burt has now taken over Jody's old store who has moved away and abandoned it, and that the rest of the town has been demolished, and everyone has moved on. Chang's now sits by itself in the middle of the desert, and is about to be reclaimed by the government because Burt refuses to pay taxes on the land. And I find this really depressing. We first see the town, named Rejection in the 1890s, get saved by the Chang family and Burt's great-grandfather, banding together to save what is theirs and renaming it to Perfection, because they're proud of what they've done, and they want more people to settle there. And then 100 years later, we see the town again pull their resources and collective abilities to save their land. Then we see the same thing again just a few years later. And I just feel like everyone giving up and packing it in and leaving in this one for no good established reason is very against the spirit of the franchise, and what the town of Perfection should stand as a symbol of. The overarching theme of these stories is that these are hard people who live in unforgiving landscapes, who survive against giant monster attacks because of their own determination and reliance on each other as a community. And to have the town seemingly fall apart for no real given reason here is kind of a bummer. In the background to the production of parts 5 and 6, there was another aspect of the story running at the same time, in contention with the Burt Gummer films. As in 2015, Blumhouse announced that they were partnering with Universal Television to create a second Tremors TV series for Amazon. There would be a direct sequel to the original film, ignoring all other sequels, with Kevin Bacon set to return. Amazon eventually passed before a pilot was even shot, but then Sci-Fi agreed to do the pilot instead. But ultimately, after watching the completed project, they chose to use that money to create the adaptation of Deadly Class instead. That month, a trailer for the pilot was released online, but still to this day the pilot itself has never surfaced in full. And based on what is here, I think it's really sad that this never happened, because I feel that this was a fresh direction that the series needed to take, and was going to go back to some of the original ideas and story roots. Because after 5 and 6, I really think that the franchise needed to become grounded again, with some more realistic characters. Because at this point, stakes are pretty much non-existent in this universe. In the first film, for example, you could actually imagine a graboid coming out of the ground and eating this girl bouncing on a pogo stick. This scene has tension because you believe that she is in real, legitimate danger. But in these later movies, you know that most of these characters are way too equipped for this scenario and will probably be fine. And even if they aren't, you don't really care. And with that, sadly, we're up to present day, with no Kevin Bacon TV show, and the release of Tremors 7 Island Fury set to come later this year. And as for right now, the main problem facing the future of this franchise is that they essentially keep remaking Part 2 over and over again. As with the exception of 4, in each movie we have characters who are very familiar with the graboid threat that they're about to face, who get called in to help deal with them in another country. Part 7 looks to be the exact same concept as well, and I think for the franchise to move forward and not stagnate further, they should break away from that mold somehow, and try and tell a more original story set in that universe, which the Kevin Bacon show looked like it was mostly going to be, which is why I'm still upset that Sci-Fi never picked this up. We now with Part 6 have confirmation that the graboids originate from prehistoric times, and that most of them are still frozen in the glaciers, and that the ones in the Perfection Valley are an offshoot that managed to survive by adapting to live in a desert environment. We've already had one set in the past, why not get weird with it again and tell one set in the future, where the graboids are freed from the melting ice and make the impending apocalypse substantially more difficult to deal with.
On a recent expedition to the Arctic, myself and a small team discovered carefully preserved beneath hundreds of feet of ice prehistoric graboids. These sons of bitches have been laying in wait for millions of years. And if this world heats up enough, every one of these bastards will wake up and kill us all.
Make a movie that honors the first one by having a Tremors meets Death Stranding style terrain management story, where a character is trying to get from point A to point B in that kind of environment, without ever touching the ground in creative ways. We've had plenty of stories about fighting the graboids. What would one look like if it was entirely about avoiding them instead? What if the graboids tilled the soil so much that they created a second Dust Bowl? What would this world look like through the eyes of someone who isn't a doomsday prepper like Bert is? What if, because El Blanco from Part 3 can't reproduce, he just continued to grow beyond anything that we've ever seen before? In a franchise called Tremors, we've never actually had any real tremors before, so what if the graboids somehow caused actual earthquakes of some sort? I just feel like there's a lot of untold potential stories here that a monster like the graboids could provide, that haven't been explored yet. And I know money is the biggest deciding factor in how these things get made, but I really don't think that you need a lot of money to tell a high-stakes story on a small scale. You don't even need to show the monsters a lot to build tension. In fact, the opposite is true. Something that 4 understood really well, but 5 and 6 missed the mark on a bit. You hardly see the graboid at all in that film. The main issue here that needs to be addressed is writing, tone, and direction. Because as of right now, all of these things are all over the place. And I was mainly hoping for the Kevin Bacon TV show to get made, because it seemed to have a tighter grasp on those aspects than what we currently have. I obviously haven't seen it yet, but Tremors 7 is probably already a bit of a lost cause. They have hired a new writer for this one, but the highest score he has on a project that he wrote on IMDb is a 5.9, which doesn't necessarily fill me with overwhelming hope. Jamie Kennedy is not returning this time, being replaced here, it seems, with John Heder. But even though I'm going to be there to watch it no matter what, if I'm being honest with you, I'm not all that excited for this one. We don't even have a trailer yet and it already just looks like more of the same. I might be wrong and it may turn out great. You never know. Bert is sporting a large survivalist looking beard in this one that may signal that they're taking the series in a different direction this time, but I kind of doubt it. It will probably just be used as a gag at the beginning of the movie and then things will return to business as usual. But whenever Tremors 8 inevitably ends up being made, I hope that some of these issues are taken into account when developing it. Because for better or worse, I really do love these movies, and I hope they bring back more of the heart and connection to these characters that made me love it to begin with. And I hope they bring back some of these ideas that made the first one the classic monster film that it is.